Today's March 31st. So, as of yesterday, this war between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for 5 weeks. And so I thought rather than talking about what's happened in the last 24 or 48 or 72 hours, I'd look back over the 5 weeks that this war has been going on and try to ask what have we learned, and maybe do a little bit of speculation on where we're headed, though I'm a little bit leery of doing that. So, first, what have we learned in 5 weeks of war between Russia and Ukraine? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious thing is that the Russian military has dramatically underperformed. Uh, Everybody expected that Russian forces would be able to conquer most of the Ukrainian army and surround Kiev within a couple of days. And while it's an important takeaway that Russia has underperformed, it's an equally important takeaway that the vast majority of the military specialists in the world failed to predict that. I think we want to think hard about why the Russian military has underperformed so much. There's issues of morale. There clearly are issues of logistics and supply. It appears that the Russian soldiers were not told that they were actually going into combat until really just before it started. So there was a certain level of unpreparedness. There's a lot more to be said about that, and perhaps in the future I'll dig more into that in a subsequent video. But related to Russian underperformance, and of course a big reason for Russian underperformance has been Ukraine's overperformance. I don't think anybody thought much of the Ukrainian army. There were those who said that since 2014 that the Ukrainian army had learned a lot and had become much better prepared compared to when it really was able to put up very little resistance in 2014, and that has turned out to be quite true. It's equally the case in what's going on with the Ukrainian military, that the nature of the way the Ukrainians are fighting this war, which is a combination of a regular military, analogous but much smaller than the Russian military, but also a group of loosely affiliated actors, sometimes in very small groups, connected to the military and sometimes independently acting from the military, has given the Ukrainians a tactical flexibility and an adaptability that's provided some real advantages on the battlefield. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this war so far is that already we see signs that military planners in various places, but not least in the United States, are looking what the Ukrainians have been doing and beginning to ask what can we learn about this for how we should plan for our next war. A third important takeaway that I think was pretty surprising for a lot of people is that the West united, and the West united very quickly. And I should say, when I say the West, in this case we mean the West in a very broad sense, right? To include Japan, South Korea, Australia, and a whole bunch of other countries around the world who normally we don't think of as being part of the West, have joined in condemnation of what Russia has done, and in many cases have joined sanctions against Russia. I think there was a lot of wonder ahead of time that if it came to war, would the Europeans in particular and the West more broadly prevaricate, delay, argue, quarrel, and so on, and in the end not do very much. I think that the extent of collaboration and the extent of sanctions that we see being enacted is at the very high end of what anybody would have predicted ahead of time. A fourth really interesting development that I don't think has received enough attention is how the Russian regime is changing. War, it's an old line in political science about the effect that war has on states and on government. And the Russian regime is changing before our eyes. It, of course, was, even before this war, it was an authoritarian regime, but it's becoming a much more authoritarian regime very quickly. Not only that, but Russian society is changing. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, it is clear, despite the fact that it's hard for us in the West to understand, it's clear that a lot of Russians support this war. One of the things that's interesting is the Russians who don't support this war, at least some percentage of them, are leaving the country. And so Russia is becoming more like itself as a result of this, and that is foreboding for the future. But we're also seeing some very interesting things about the extent to which the Putin regime may not be as united as we think. That it appears that Putin or who's ever making decisions has maybe not gotten completely honest information from some of the folks in the military. So there's a lot of turmoil within the Russian state. But above all, the point is this is going from being an authoritarian state to something bordering on the kind of totalitarianism and intense propaganda-driven motivation for war that we saw from the Soviet Union or from Germany in World War II. Another big question, this isn't really a takeaway or something we've learned so far, but something we've been forced to ask so far in this war is what's with Putin? Is he as rational and as calculating as we tended to think he was, only much more determined to control Ukraine? Or has he, as many people have said, has he sort of lost the plot? Or is it something maybe in between, which is just that he's just a lot angrier and a lot more impatient to get the results he wants? So I think we've always done a lot of speculating about Putin, but I think that the way this war started and the mixture of bombastic speeches and flat-out lies that we see coming from Putin makes us want to think even more about what exactly is going on with him. Turning now, though, from what's happened in 5 weeks to what we see happening in the future, the big picture I think that's worth stressing is that this war is in a phase where it's shifting from being a sprint to being a marathon. Over the first few weeks, the stress has been, for the Russians, it's been how quickly can they take out the Ukrainian army and try to surround Kiev and some other big cities. For the Ukrainians, it's been how quickly can they rise to meet that challenge. For the West, it's been how quickly can we get weapons to the Ukrainians, how quickly can we come together to enact the kind of sanctions that might have an impact on Russia. Now, things are shifting from how quickly can you do things to how long can you sustain them for. And that's going to be particularly true for the Russian and Ukrainian armies, both in terms of morale, but also in terms of supply. How long can they keep up the things that they've been doing? There are signs that Russia is really struggling, of course, in terms of material and morale. But there are also some signs that Russia is now turning to the long game, pausing in its attack around Kiev, for example, not because it's going to pull back, but because it's going to reload, resupply, and come back with more determination down the road. We'll have to see to what extent that happens and to what extent the Ukrainians are able to continue what they've been doing. In terms of where we're headed, and again, I'll say it over and over again, I'm hesitant to make predictions, but I seem to end up doing it anyhow. What will happen on the battlefield is, I still think, unpredictable. I can imagine circumstances in which this drags on for a very, very long time. That's my best guess. But if the Russians get their act together, one can imagine circumstances in which they either start taking dramatic amounts of ground in the east or along the Black Sea coast, and I think you can still imagine a Russian renewed offensive that really puts Kiev under threat. It's just very, very hard to say. Because what goes on the battlefield is unpredictable, what goes on at the negotiating table, I think, is equally unpredictable. I've been skeptical about the likelihood of an early end to this conflict at the bargaining table. I remain skeptical, but the thing I would always say is that negotiations and war seem like two different things, right? One is peaceful and it's at a table somewhere. In this case, it's in Turkey. The other is this messy, terrible, violent thing on the battlefield. But they're part of the same process. And negotiations will only succeed to the extent that the conditions on the battlefield provide for that. And we just don't know how that's going to go. Reaching out to the much, much bigger picture, an important takeaway from the first 5 weeks, but also an important implication for the future, is that we do not live in the same world that we lived in 6 weeks ago. We live in a world now that is increasingly becoming defined by an almost existential conflict between the West and Russia, potentially between the West and between some sort of loose alliance between Russia and China. Globalization, which has driven our economic lives for the past 3 decades, now may be in retreat. We're in an era of potentially increasing prices and potentially rising unemployment that we have in a condition called stagflation that we haven't seen since the 1970s. So I think back to a phrase that the first President Bush used at the end of the Cold War. He used the phrase New World Order. What we are facing now in 2022 is a New World Disorder. And how that's going to shake out is hard to say, but I think it's safe to say that it's likely to define global politics. And because of that, a lot of things that happen in our everyday lives for weeks, months, and years to come. Those of us who live in California, where we're paying upwards of $5 a gallon for gasoline now, might have to get used to that. The last thing I want to think about looking towards the future, and I'll just talk about it briefly, and I'm going to hope to do a video entirely on this subject in the future, but I've got to collect some more information first, is about the impact on food supplies, both in Ukraine, where I think there's particularly reason for concern, but also in the world more broadly. Ukraine and Russia are both massive grain exporters. What happens to people who are living on the margins around the world when the price of grain doubles? More to the point, what happens in Ukraine 6 months or 8 months from now when the consequences of the spring planting not happening come to bear? That's something, as I said, I've started to look into because I've got some friends who are deeply interested in that, and hopefully we'll address that in the future. But the big picture is already this war has surprised us in the fact that it happened, in the fact that Russia didn't win quickly, and now we are in this situation where something that had us intensely focused is now going to become potentially a long-term factor of life for people in Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the world. And that's kind of an interesting adjustment that we're now undertaking.